joining. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Future of France, Post-Election Perspectives, hosted by the French-American Foundation. It's my great pleasure. My name is Cindy Clavassa. I'm the program manager for the Foundation's Transatlantic Forum. The French-American Foundation is dedicated to strengthening the transatlantic relationship through a variety of programs and initiatives aimed at fostering mutual understanding between the United States and France. And the Transatlantic Forum is a very special program. It brings together leading French and American professionals to engage in deep and meaningful discussions on pressing contemporary issues that affect both sides of the Atlantic, just like this webinar today. And in today's webinar, we will discuss and analyze the results and implications of the recent French legislative elections. And given the complexity and the unexpected outcomes of these elections, our discussion today will unpack what this means for the future of France and potentially for Europe. I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for today, Negah Angha, member of our Transatlantic Forum. Thank you very much for giving us your time today and support us. You will be leading the conversation with our speakers, Diane de Vignemont, joining us from Paris, and Cole Stangler joining us from Marseille. And they will bring their unique on-the-ground perspectives to our discussion. And I'm going to hand it over to Negah. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'm excited for this discussion.
Thank you, and good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. A warm welcome to everyone, and a special thank you to Cindy and the French-American Foundation for organizing today's insightful panel discussion, as she mentioned, titled The Future of France, Post-Election Perspectives. I'm delighted to moderate this session with our two distinguished journalists, Cole Stangler, a French-American journalist known for his coverage on labor and politics, and Diane de Vignemont, a freelance journalist with deep historical knowledge of French historical political dynamics. Both are joining us from France, and I'm connecting here from Washington. Today, we'll explore some of the key questions to understand the recent shifts in France's political landscape, and speculate on future directions. For the end of our session, we'll open the floor for audience questions, so please do get your questions ready. And so let's begin. Sunday's elections saw an unprecedented turnout, defying polls that predicted a surge for the far right. Instead, a left alliance, including many far-left parliamentarians, emerged as the frontrunners, significantly disrupting President Macron's centrist coalition. With France now facing a politically fragmented landscape and a hung parliament, what are the immediate implications and potential paths forward? Cole, perhaps you could start us off and share some of your observations from southern France, followed by Diane, and perhaps Diane, you can also share your observations from being based in the Paris region. So Cole, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Negah, for the introduction. Thank you, Cindy. Thanks everyone for listening. So I'll just get right into it. Yeah, I mean, like you said, the outcome was not necessarily what the polls were predicting. We have really, for the first time in the history of the Fifth Republic in France, we have three distinct blocs in the National Assembly. That's something that's quite unprecedented. Three blocs that are actually quite hostile to one another, that all have very, very similar levels of similar shares of seats. So the coalition that came in first is indeed the left-wing coalition, the New Popular Front, which was sort of cobbled together after Macron's very unexpected decision to call these snap elections in the first place. I don't know if we'll have the chance to maybe go into what the motivations for that might have been, but in any case, you had this left-wing coalition that again was sort of cobbled together despite real tensions between the parties, that was actually able to win a plurality of votes, nowhere near an absolute majority. That key number is 289 out of 577 seats in the National Assembly. So they fell well short of that mark, but they do have the largest share of seats. And I think if we're thinking again about these three forces, which for me are really kind of the way to think about French politics today, you have a left, you have a centrist bloc from Emmanuel Macron, and you have a far right bloc. What's happened is the left bloc, if you look at their vote shares, has increased just slightly compared to previous elections. You have a Macronist centrist bloc that is lost a lot of support going back to the last legislative elections. And then you have a far right that despite, the headline here is that yes, the left did win more votes than any other coalition, but the far right did win. It has a record number of seats now in the National Assembly. It's never had this many seats. It's still rising. So that's kind of the dynamic where we're at today with these three blocks. And of course, the issue, which maybe Diane can get into it as well, but the question now is, who's going to form a government? You don't have an absolute majority. After the 2022 legislative elections, Macron's coalition had what's known as a relative majority, so just short of that 289 figure that they need to form a government, but they relied on support from the right-wing Les Républicains party to sort of get their legislation across the finish line. Now the question is, how do you basically get to that 289 figure? And it's not really easy. Maybe just very quickly before I'll pass it over to Diane, just to give you three kind of scenarios here that are being talked about of, again, how do you create a government? One is, the left is saying right now, well, yes, we don't have an absolute majority, but we got more seats than anyone else. It should be up to us to form a government. The problem is you have, parties that are debating amongst themselves. In any case, that's one option, a minority government led by the left, and we can look at maybe what that might look like in practice. That's one option. Another option is you have elements of the Macronists, not everyone, who are interested in forming a government that would involve some, but not all elements of that left-wing coalition. They consider La France Insoumise, the left populist party, to be kind of off limits. So could we maybe have some kind of coalition government with the Macronists and some parts of the left? So breaking that new popular front that I talked about, that alliance that was cobbled together, that's maybe option number two. Option number three is if neither of these look like they're gaining traction, could France move towards a kind of Italian scenario under Mario Draghi, where you have a kind of technocratic caretaker government that is basically sufficiently inoffensive so that it's able to not get blocked in the National Assembly? That's maybe another option. Again, but we're things are very much up in the air. The key deadline to look at is July 18th, which is when the National Assembly needs to name a new president. And I think things might be a little bit more clear before then. The left said they wanted to offer up some names for potential prime ministers by the end of this week, and now it looks like, well, maybe it might take a little bit longer. So we're kind of still in this kind of period of uncertainty for at least the next few days, it looks like.
Yeah. Hi, thanks for having me. And thanks for Cole for explaining this so well. So yeah, Negah, you asked me about the immediate implications and potential paths forward. And I think as a historian by training, I always like to look back at how we did it in the past in similar situations. And part of the surprise of Sunday night of this election result that no one saw coming can be explained by looking back at our history. And essentially, the surprise of what happened on Sunday is that the Republican front held against all odds. The Republican front is a long-standing tradition in the Fifth Republic. Ever since the National Front was created in the 70s, whenever it got to the second round of a local or parliamentary or national election, whichever party came in third in any three-way race would desist in favor of whichever came second, so that as many votes as possible went against the national rally. And so there was some doubts whether this would work in this particular election, because Marine Le Pen has been so successful at sort of cleansing her party's image and reputation. There were questions whether the Republican front of old, would stick, and it did actually. And so that's actually a lesson going forward, whether Macron resigns and we have a presidential election, or whether the assembly is dissolved again in a year, we know that the Republican front can hold. So that's one historical lesson and some sort of a hope as we go forward. Another thing we can learn, I think, from history is if we look at occurrences in the Fifth Republic of either coalition governments or cohabitations in the assembly. And we have sort of three fairly recent examples, whether it be, Mitterrand, a left-wing president governing with a right-wing prime minister, or Chirac, a right-wing president governing with Lionel Jospin. That was just in the 90s. It's not that far away. And the French, aren't that used to cohabitation governments, but they don't hate them that much. Not something they're unused to it, but we're not too afraid of it. And so that's, as we go forward, but something we know sort of works and sort of keeps the country governed when we have such a fragmented assembly. And so I think and it's a big if the left-wing alliance can put forward a unique candidacy for PM, then maybe cohabitation government is what we're looking at. And it's something we've done before. And as Cole said, it's something our neighbors do. So that's maybe a way that the country can be governed. The question is whether it will happen before or after the Olympics, whether, the Olympics will happen in a governable or ungovernable France as the entire world looks at us. That's sort of what's at stake here.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, truly, the timing is quite incredible. And, perhaps, Diane, maybe you can kind of unpack this a little bit for us. Considering President Macron's recent decision to dissolve the parliament, which was incredibly bold and a controversial move, how would you assess the strategy in light of the election results from Sunday?
Yeah, bold is kind. I think some commentators have said crazy. It's been a really interesting time to pay attention to what political commentators are saying, because ever since June 9, when he announced the dissolution, you had this sort of phenomenon where you looked at, you listened to the radio or you looked at TV and you read the newspapers, and you had political commentators who you trust to explain the situations answer journalists by telling them, I don't know what he's doing. I can't explain it. Lots of people have put it in context of him being very isolated, progressively getting rid of some of his closest advisors and sort of governing. The French call it a Jupiterian rule. He's governing like a Greek god. So there's a bit of that. As for, the outcome of his bold or crazy choice, it's been really interesting to look at as well, because the international press has been quite praising of his decision. There's a lot of him being called a political genius. I mean, not everywhere. I mean, Cole recently wrote an article in Time where he pretty much didn't say that, but there's been a lot of praise internationally at this genius political move, because he did manage to sort of hold the center. He lost seats, but not as many at the hard left, France Unbowed, and the national rally got less than expected. So it did work in a way. But if you look nationally at him, having 9 days until June 18 to form a government, well, the Olympics are starting again 9 days after that. The entire world is not only coming to Paris, but also going to be looking at Paris. And on the left, there is a lot of talk about, where do we go from there? And in 1936, the original Popular Front, part of the reason it achieved as much as it did in the 30s, this left-wing alliance, and is remembered in history, is because once the Popular Front got elected, the entire country erupted into strike. There were 12,000 strikes across the country, with some 2 million people striking, walking out, occupying factories. And so there's a real question of, will that happen in the next few weeks? And how will that affect the Olympics? So we sort of had to put the consequences, the electoral consequences are perhaps good for Macron, but the on the ground in Paris, there's a bit of a worry about what the next few weeks will look like.
No, indeed. Again, the timing of all this was quite fascinating. So many pros and cons, and I know we're short on. We don't have that much time, but each of our discussion points can take hours to unpack. But Cole, let me turn to you for a second. In response to the election outcomes, the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire has voiced concerns about a potential financial crisis. How do you foresee these political changes affecting France's economic policies, especially regarding fiscal reforms and employment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing to always, it's a very good question, but I think one thing to always keep in mind is, Bruno Le Maire, like anyone else serving in the cabinet, in addition to having these, these important responsibilities, representing the French government, determining financial and economic policies, Bruno Le Maire is also a politician. He's a politician who is also situated on the more conservative side of the Macronist coalition. And so I think you also need to, not underestimate the amount of, rhetoric here that's a part of I think what he said. That was, I think, in many ways, a kind of political intervention. Bruno Le Maire is part of the more conservative wing of the party that is more hostile towards the prospects of aligning with the left-wing parties that did fairly well on Sunday. And so, Le Maire also himself is being floated as a potential presidential contender. So I think these are just kind of important considerations. He's also a politician. Because I think, if you actually look at the program, and I think it's important to, to keep in mind too, where even if the left is able to, I'm going to speculate a little bit here, but even if the left is able to form a minority government, I don't think we should be naive enough to think that the entire economic program of the left is going to be applied. In that scenario, they'd have to be very cognizant of not losing the support of the rest of the National Assembly. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Even if the left were able to form a minority government, there would be a kind of almost naturally kind of moderating effect. Unless, I guess, the scenario that Diane has sort of floated of mass strikes. Frankly, I don't think that we're kind of at that moment in France right now, though maybe I'll be wrong. But if we actually look at the program of the New Popular Front, it's interesting because when we talk about kind of structural reforms, what Macron was known for at certainly the beginning of his presidential term, one of his signature moves was loosening French labor laws to make it easier to essentially lay off workers, to make it harder for them to collect damages in labor courts if the employers are found of unjust termination. Those labor law reforms were quite controversial at the time, but they're actually, if you look at the left program, they're not even saying they're going to repeal Macron's labor law reforms. They're saying they're going to repeal other things, but when we talk about kind of core reforms to the French labor market, the left isn't even saying that they're going to get rid of those reforms. So I think that's one important thing to keep in mind. One of the huge differences between the Macronist coalition, I said the previous government, and the left is when it comes to taxes. The Macronists famously do not want to raise taxes, even when we've seen some unexpected revenue problems, state revenue problems emerge recently. So they were very insistent about not raising taxes. The left's program, they do want to raise taxes on, have a more progressive tax structure. One of the most notable measures in their program is reimposing the wealth tax in France, which used to apply to all assets of 1.3 million euros and above. Now it only applies to real estate assets. So there would be an expansion or return of the old wealth tax. That presumably would be more state revenue. They've talked about having an exit tax as well. These are measures that mean more state revenue. It would certainly mean that the government would be more interested in sort of taxing the well-off in France, which is again a huge difference between Macronists and the left, but I think that's very far from talking about a financial crisis, which is a quite serious, I think a quite serious term to be throwing around. And maybe one last just item I'll talk about very, very briefly. Another programmatic difference if you look at the platform of the left versus the Macronists. So I mentioned wealth tax, a more progressive tax structure in general. Another huge difference is the minimum wage. The left wants to significantly raise the minimum wage. Right now, just under 1,400 euros a month after Social Security contributions. They want to hike it to 1,600 euros a month. So presumably that means more costs for employers. Is that a financial crisis? I'm not so sure. So certainly, yes, the well-off would be, paying more. Wages would be increased, but that's again assuming the left could implement their whole program. We're in the situation now where you're going to have necessarily compromise and moderation. So, I think, to answer the question very bluntly, I think that term financial crisis is a little exaggerated.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you for that sort of response and helping us think through it. I mean, as you said, there's quite a bit of speculation right now, and obviously rhetoric during this time of uncertainty. What I was hoping we could maybe do is delve a little deeper into some of the anticipated policy shifts, both domestically and internationally. Noting the fact that President Macron now has to work directly with the parliament. And while this sort of election cycle did not affect his position, he still has 3 years left in his term. It certainly influences the policy landscape. And so, Diane, let's start with you. And given the election results on July 8th, what changes might we expect in France's foreign policy, particularly its relations with the EU neighbors and the international community?
Yeah. So I'll start with the international and then I'll get to the EU because it's a whole other can of worms. But internationally, it's pretty much, I'm going to give you the same answer that Cole gave you of nationally, is that the left-wing alliance ran on a very wide-ranging program of international changes that they wanted to make. The question is going to be whether they can implement any of it. But for instance, they ran on a proposal of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and recognition of the state of Palestine. They asked for increased aid to Ukraine. They asked for, they ran on an end to the colonial tensions in New Caledonia. So again, all of that, the question is whether if they're going to be able to implement any, rather than all of it, in a hung parliament and in a time of crisis. With the EU, it's really, really going to be very interesting to look at, because we can't forget that the National Rally did incredibly well in the European election, and quite brilliantly, they waited until yesterday, so a day after the election, to announce which group they were going to be joining at the EU Parliament. And they announced that they were going to be joining the I believe it's called Patriots for Europe group, which includes far-right parties from across Europe, famously pro-Putin, pro-Russia. So we're looking at a French majority in the European Parliament that is very much pro-Russia, and a tiny minority in the French Parliament that's very pro-Ukraine. So it's going to be sort of interesting looking at how the French legislative election plays out against the EU Parliament, and how sort of all of these different coalitions play out with one another on the international scale. It's also going to be quite interesting in this, the year of elections, to see how this left-wing alliance holds and how it deals with the new Labour government in the UK. And it's obviously a very different scenario having a left-wing majority, however small, when faced with potential election of Donald Trump in the US. It's very, very different than had the National Rally gotten a majority. So all of that is sort of up in the air, but it'll definitely be very interesting to look at.
No, indeed. Indeed, it will be. I think, Cole, maybe from your perch, with these new shifts in France's political landscape. I mean, how might the government's domestic policy priorities maybe influence, say, I don't know, trade regulations or openness to foreign investments? You know, what should we be seeing from the economic front?
Well, I think I think one of the biggest policy differences again is comes down to, so I'll, very, very quickly in France you have one of the most kind of politically fraught issues is the question of public services. The left, key difference, wants to invest a lot more in public services, so that means more state spending. When we talk also about the vote for the far right, there's a sense, I think, among a lot of people on the left that the far right does well in these zones that have been sort of abandoned by the French state, where you have less public services, less trains, less hospitals. We saw that, the uprising of kind of the Yellow Vest movement in the beginning of Macron's first term, that's kind of hanging over people's heads. And so I think that the sense on the left coalition is, well, it's not just a kind of moral duty, but there's actually a political responsibility to increase public services and increase spending on public services. Okay, so in concrete terms, what does that mean? It means more state spending. And like I was saying earlier, the left is much less hostile, I should say. Actually, they're in favor of increasing taxes, to be blunt. So that means a lot of those changes. I think I might have kind of inadvertently answered much of this question earlier, but when we're talking about reimposing the wealth tax, talking about one policy I didn't mention, another one of kind of Macron's landmark reforms that the left wants to repeal was Macron put in place a flat tax on capital gains at his very first budget. The left wants to get rid of that flat tax on capital gains, so that means a higher, but they would say more progressive tax on capital gains. I think that's another big policy difference when it comes to the economy. And I think really, the biggest flashpoint is really, this question of taxes. I think you have different approaches for looking at kind of the role of the state and whose responsibility it is to pay. And again, it's a careful line of not, I don't want to speculate too much. Are there certain policies that the left does want to move on if they were able to be in government? I think when it comes to regulation, I think I'll end right there, just to not ramble on too much. I think taxes is a huge difference. And again, we'll have to see how it plays out too, because so much is uncertain.
Certain times, but it's helpful to be able to speculate and sort of talk through some of these issues as we sort of see how the next few weeks evolve. One of the things I really wanted to touch on was which was a critical issue during this entire election cycle, and that was on immigration. It was a dominant theme. And again, despite the National Rally's third place finish, its anti-immigration rhetoric was incredibly prominent. And, it continues to circulate. So I was hoping to hear actually from both of you what you think are the implications of these election results on social cohesion and domestic policies in France, particularly concerning immigration and national security. But also maybe you could share a little bit more of kind of the vibe that you were hearing, be it in Paris or in Marseille. So Diane, maybe you could start us off, and then Cole, we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. As of now, nothing's changed. It's still, we're still getting the Macronist policies on immigration. So I'm in Paris. So the night after, pretty much, it felt like the entire city celebrated somewhat partial victory on the Place de la République. The next morning, a migrant encampment in Paris was evacuated to make space ahead of the Olympics. So that's been going on for about a year now, and that hasn't stopped. And same as with the international and national policy, all of that will depend on how much the left-wing alliance can actually achieve within its program. The New Popular Front ran on a huge array of immigration policies. They want to cut back the highly controversial Darmanin law, so the immigration law that was passed in December. They want to make the 10-year residency visa the norm. Like, they have a huge array of very, very specific policies with regards to immigration, but we run into the same problem, which is that a lot of these policies have to do with the European level of parliament, where the far right had huge gains on, it seems like years away, but it was only on Sunday, June 9. And so there's going to be a difficult sort of play between left-leaning French Assembly and the European Parliament. And again, the far right there have united with the Patriots for Europe group, which is very anti-immigration. But what's been really interesting is really how much of this sort of national campaign, this SNAP national campaign, has been played around the topic of immigration. Jordan Bardella, the 28-year-old president of the National Rally Party, in his concession speech, essentially alluded to the fact that he supposedly lost the campaign in part because of fake news around his declarations on binationals. Early on in the campaign, he started saying that he was against binationality, and then he went back to saying he was actually only against binationals holding specific roles in government. And he was, walking it back slowly, but that really became a focus point of the campaign. And France has a lot of binationals, so that definitely influenced their vote, but it influenced a lot of voters who might have been unsure. And he said that it was fake news and that cost him the election. And so I think it's not anodyne that in his concession speech he mentioned that. It really truly shows how much of the campaign was played around that discussion of immigration. And Macron, whenever he wanted to criticize the left-wing alliance, described their program as immigrationist, which is a word straight out of the National Rally's dictionary. It's nothing he never said before, something we never heard before from the center. And so it's really like this immigrationist debate was a huge part of a campaign, truly.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Diane. I mean, I think the immigration question took up so much of the of this campaign, and I think we can also ask, what was the RN proposing to do, and why did it backfire? I think that the question around dual nationals having jobs, which the RN is very vague about, as Diane alluded to, I think that really cost them because, frankly, it alarmed a lot of people. When you start talking about not to legitimize the RN discourse, but I think when they started to want, I think for a lot of people who maybe are sympathetic to the to parts of their arguments about there being too many immigrants in France, frankly, that is what they say. That discourse does have traction in France. I think even some of those people who might have listened to that message, I think were frankly a little bit turned off from the more kind of radical edge of this, which is when you start talking about French nationals not having certain rights to have certain jobs. And again, they were very vague about this in the campaign. First, it was, well, only certain jobs, they can't have that are in defense or sensitive sectors. Then you had other RN officials saying, well, no, actually, ministers shouldn't be dual national. And so I think that really cost them. Another big issue was the RN wanting to repeal this long-standing tradition of birthright citizenship in France, this idea that if you're born on French soil to two foreign parents, you can obtain French nationality, been around since the 16th century. Not even the Vichy regime wanted to get rid of that or got rid of that. The RN wanted to get rid of that. And so I think that really produced, these two policies, along with the kind of the history of the RN, alienated a lot of voters, especially between that first round and the second round. And you saw it here, I saw it here in Marseille, where I live, where it's a city where you have a lot of immigrants and descendants of immigrants who I think felt directly sort of threatened by this proposal of the RN to restrict their rights as French citizens. So you had a tremendous amount of backlash, especially in the center of the city where you have a lot of, like I said, immigrants and descendants of immigrants. Where I was, where I am now, you can still see the kind of anti-RN posters accusing them of being extremists, fascists, etc. A lot of, anti-RN graffiti. And you see it in Marseille walking around. It's a city where you have a lot of people who are of Algerian descent, North African descent, from the Comoros, from Armenia. So it's a city of immigrants. That said, I don't want to, it's not just as if it's one big kind of happy melting pot, because the RN actually did fairly well in Marseille as well. The 7 deputies that were elected across the city, 4 are from the left, but 3 are from the National Rally. And so if you go up to the kind of the what are called the Quartier Nord, the northern neighborhoods of Marseille, where you have big housing towers that are quite isolated from the rest of the city, a lot of drug-related violence, people descended of immigrants, those areas themselves vote for the left, and a lot of abstention, so low turnout. But when you start moving out to the kind of houses and neighborhoods around that are close to those big housing towers, you have a huge vote for the National Rally, and they actually want a seat in the north of Marseille because of low turnout among people, the sort of more poor working class people of immigrant descent, and then higher turnout among the sort of lower middle class people living next to the housing towers. And also, if you go to the southern part of Marseille, and I'll end on this point, it's also representative of another kind of important voting bloc of the RN increasingly, which is people that used to vote for the mainstream right-wing Parti des Républicains are now shifting more to the far right. So in sort of middle class, wealthier, upper middle class, if not upper class neighborhoods in the south of Marseille, you have people that used to vote for the mainstream right that are now voting for the far right. And we see this process really happening across France. Marseille is such a kind of weird city, but in a lot of ways, it's representative of these kind of bigger national trends that we see.
Yeah, maybe can I have time to add something to that?
Please.
Yeah. So one of the huge ways in which immigration played a role in this campaign is that, as Cole mentioned, not only did people who used to vote for the traditional right-wing Republican Party started voting for the RN, but politicians from the right-wing traditional, Gaullist Republican Party actually joined the RN, and they did so because they agree. They say, I believe the number they used was 99.9%. They agree 99.9% with the RN's policy, and that's something that was, so completely not only unexpected but sort of tragic in a way, because this was the party founded by Charles de Gaulle, the resistance leader turned president of France. This party that's been around since the literal founding of the French Republic, founded by the founder of the Fifth Republic, collapsed in and of itself. Some of its members rallied the RN, and the remaining members lost an incredible amount of seats and might now be forced to govern with, a president who they loathe. So it's been a very interesting moment, and all of that has had to do with the right fringe of the Republican Party agreeing with the RN on immigration.
Thank you both. And just a quick note for our audience, please start sending forward your questions so we can turn to them in a little bit. But before we turn to the audience for their questions, do you have sort of some closing thoughts that you would want to share as we sort of think through? Cole, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I don't know if I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but I just saw in the Q&A, because it's something I actually meant to talk about when we talked about those policy differences between the left. And thank you to the person who mentioned it. One of the big promises of the left when we talk about, so again, going back to Bruno Le Maire, the finance minister's warning of a financial crisis, I think one of the policies that he has in mind that's become, such a polarizing, well, I don't know if polarizing is the right word, such a hot issue in France is this question of retirement reform. Macron famously raised the retirement age from 62 to 64, triggering this mass wave of protest. The left has promised to repeal Macron's retirement reform. And so that very clearly, from a kind of budgetary standpoint, means you have to make up that hole in the budget. That's a huge difference between, again, the left and the Macronist coalition. Again, it's hard to imagine a coalition supported by Macronists then agreeing to repeal Macron's signature retirement reform. That's kind of hard to imagine, but that isn't in the left program. So just that one point. And then Well, I'll pass it along to Jen. I have a lot of things to say, but maybe depending on the on the questions, I can kind of fit it in later. So I'll cut myself off there.
All right. Yeah, closing words. It's been a truly wild time to start a career as a journalist. I've been doing this for 2 years. I'm meant to be on vacation, but it's been interesting to be here for this and to try and explain it to an international audience. We sort of have two big échéances, sort of two big dates we need to keep in mind for the next few years. We have 2026, the municipal elections, and 2027, the next presidential election. And, you know, barring any other, either radical, brilliant ideas or crazy ideas from Macron, the presidential election should be in 2027. There's increased talk of him maybe taking this as a vote of no confidence and then resigning, so that, you know, if he resigns, he can't run in the next presidential race, but he can run in the one after that. All of that is sort of, I think, unlikely, but still up in the air. But yeah, in terms of closing thoughts, I hope that France does what France does and takes the summer holidays off of the craziness, and we can all come back fresh in September. But with the Olympics coming in, it's unlikely, and I think we'll have an interesting few weeks ahead of us.
Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, it's definitely a charged environment, and as you rightly noted, this is not going to be a normal summer. You will have the world descending onto Paris very, very soon. We have some great questions coming in from the audience. Let me just sort of state one of them, which was kind of on my list of questions that I thought was really important. The question is, many in the environmental advocacy community were worried that a right-wing victory would spell for policies to address climate change. How will the new government, presumably driven by some left-wing influence, approach climate policy?
I can take that one. It's one of the very interesting things to watch in this campaign has been the Green Party. They didn't do, very impressively in the European elections. They got what they needed to get their 5 seats and their campaign reimbursed, but they've sort of come out on top of this particular snap legislative election, in part because, they're more consensual and center-left than the communists and the hard-left France Unbowed. But their leader, Marine Tondelier, has been in the limelight a lot. Like, she's been talked about often as a potential PM because she's a consensual figure. She's been talked about a lot because in every single televised debate we had in this campaign, it was only men. And Jordan Bardella was sort of famously afraid to debate her because she's been a local politician in the town of Hénin-Beaumont, which is where the RN has, ruled for years and years, and she's been in the opposition for years and years. And as a Green Party leader, she knows, and she's very good at saying what the RN does to climate policy. And so with her sort of coming out on top of this campaign, we thankfully had the sort of ecological question on our mind more than we would have, I think, if it was just a question of the left against the right. And the New Popular Front has an incredibly ambitious ecological program. At the risk of repeating myself, it now becomes about whether or not they can implement it. But I think, friends of the environment or, ecologically minded people definitely did breathe a sigh of relief when the RN didn't go through, because, well, they have recently made an effort to touch on ecology a bit more. It's sort of new to them and not a priority. So it's, whether it's a left-wing PM or left-wing coalition or left and center coalition, I think there's some hope that ecology can remain, that the environment can remain a topic of discussion, even in a parliament. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Cole, but. somewhat
Yeah,
hopeful.
the New Popular Front program talks about carbon neutrality by 2050. Maybe to focus on kind of a point of tension. There's something that doesn't come up a lot in that program, which is the question of nuclear energy, which is a very kind of sensitive topic, and especially on, well, it's a sensitive topic on the French left. France has an enormous amount of nuclear energy production. And the RN actually talked a lot about celebrating France's nuclear grid as sort of a source of energy sovereignty. And I think, frankly, a lot of people still regard it in that way. The Green Party that Diane was alluding to famously is opposed to nuclear energy. And so that's the kind of, when I talked about those tensions that exist among left-wing parties, that's definitely one of them is what to do with nuclear energy. And I think that where they've come down on the issue is not getting rid of existing nuclear plants. I don't think that would be a position too far. And you have certain parts of the coalition that are quite supportive of nuclear energy. The Communist Party, for instance, that has an old workforce associated with the nuclear energy sector. But right now they're sort of agreed among like other issues to not talk about it too much. That is one of the big friction points, though, among the left's coalition.
And sort of building off of that theme a little bit, one of the questions that has come in is sort of this from an international relations slant. And let me just read the question, or there are two questions rather. Does the potential lack of a strong, legitimate French government create additional risks of diluting France's voice in the transatlantic debate, particularly in the scenario of a Trump re-election, historically less inclined to compromise with NATO or Europe, for instance? Or is the French president the key only real decision maker in such matters? And then the second half of the question, as a result, can it reduce the strength of the Western coalition on a global stage in the context of heightened Russian, Iranian, Chinese political and geopolitical descendants and interferences, essentially?
I think maybe I'll just quickly, then I'll let Diane compliment. I mean, I think, one of the, I think I said this before to other people, and I think it's kind of a point of I think everyone sort of agrees that we're all kind of learning a lot more about well, Diane is a historian, so she probably knows it better than we do, but we're all learning a lot more about the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, which leaves France with this, quite odd semi-presidential system. The president has a lot of authority, but according to the Constitution, it's the government that shapes policy, and the government is accountable to the parliament and more specifically the National Assembly. And so the tradition of cohabitation in many ways cohabitation is not a word that appears in the French Constitution. It's something that the norms of which were sort of hammered out over time in accordance, obviously, with the Constitution. But I'm saying all this to emphasize the fact that the previous cohabitation arrangements that were put into place, giving the prime minister, having the president conserve certain responsibilities while giving certain responsibilities to the prime minister, a lot of these were hammered out over time and through practice. And you had moments in which there was even kind of awkward moments of not knowing. Sort of the famous question of, when you want to talk to when you want to talk to who's in power in France, do you call the prime minister or do you call the president? Who do you need to talk to? And so, the president remains the head of state, represents France internationally. But it even caused quite a it was a source of controversy during the campaign when the National Rally said, we intend to impose our policies, and Macron will be the sort of symbolic head of the armies. That's going to be his role, going to these sort of events like he's in Washington, at the G7, shaking hands of foreign dignitaries. But ultimately, we intend to impose policies of our own. And so I think a lot of these questions aren't entirely clear, and we'll have to have a kind of new arrangements. Hammered out, new norms that are going to be respected, but maybe subject to negotiation. Again, this is this is according to the French Constitution. So it's again, again, I don't want to speculate too much, but maybe I'll cut myself off there, and Diane, you can add if you curious to hear what you
Yeah, I'll
think.
just add some historical context to your great contemporary explanation, which is that the Fifth Republic was created in 1958 by Charles de Gaulle, who made it in his image, who created something that would work with someone like him at the helm, a strong leader with a strong voice who was able to stand up to the Americans and the international alliance and enemies and whatnot. And I mean, that's evolved. Macron tries very, very hard, but he's no de Gaulle, and he's significantly younger and he's significantly more isolated. But we've had many cohabitations in the past. They're allowed for by the French Constitution, and France didn't drop off the face of the earth when we had cohabitations. We had one in the late 90s. We had one during the Kuwait War. Like we didn't drop off the face of the earth, and France held strong. And I think it'll be interesting, if Trump has the choice to talk to either Macron, who he knows and has struggled with, and also really got along with at different times, or some sort of obscure left-wing leader, that consensual leader that the alliances pulled out of, because we're going to have to pick someone not controversial, so it's not going to be someone incredibly famous. So that'll be interesting.
Thank you. And I know we're getting short on time, and we'll take this last question in the chat box. With the U.S. presidential election coming up, what lessons do you think the U.S. could learn from this election in France?
Ooh, good question.
Maybe to go back to what I was saying, but it's different because Trump is establishment, because he is a Republican candidate, whereas at the moment, still to this day, the constitutional body in France has ruled that the RN is a far right party. They're not extra parliamentary, but they're still to the far right, and they've never governed before. They're not as establishment as Trump is. So I guess the Republican front that I was mentioning, the sort of the left-wing Republicans and the center Democrats sort of, putting aside their differences during the campaign to hold against Trump, that could be a lesson. We have a huge, that was one of the most beautiful graphic posters of the left-wing campaigns, was a poster with hearts everywhere that said, we'll fight after. And they've started fighting a lot since yesterday already, but they waited until the end of the campaign. So maybe a lesson is for the more right-wing Democrats and the more left-wing Republicans to put aside their differences and try and come together. I don't know how well that'll work, again, because Trump is not, he's a lot more establishment than the far right is in France.
Yeah, I think, one of the, I was actually just in the US on a reporting trip just before the elections in France. In a lot of parts of the country that vote very heavily Republican, voted heavily for Trump. They had this very significant urban-rural divide in the US. We also see it in France, but I think, it's interesting to see that the left in France still, they lost a lot of seats. It's not perfect, but they still are able to actually win in some parts of the country that have, that are more rural, that have suffered from deindustrialization. And I think maybe looking at some of those strategies that the left in France successfully applied, could be interesting. Someone like François Ruffin in the north of France, in the department of the Somme in Picardy. I think it's an interesting kind of figure to look at for how do you kind of win on a kind of left populist program in a part of the country that's skewing more to the far right. I think that's one thing, and maybe I'll end with, I know this is being recorded, but I'll push the envelope a little bit here. I think because we're at the very end. I think a lot of people thought that the left coalition wasn't going to be possible. They were up in they're facing very difficult circumstances, but they were able to to decide very quickly that they needed to achieve certain things. And I think, Democrats who are maybe hesitating about what approach to take, even involving what candidate should be at the top of the ticket, should maybe think about actually the future of democracy in a very serious way, about what are the consequences of having the far right win. And if that's the primary concern at the end of the day, then maybe that requires making certain decisions that are maybe uncomfortable to make, that elicit, pushback from certain people. But I think, both countries are facing this very significant, serious threat of the far right. And, I think maybe that sense of urgency and making tough decisions, I think maybe Democrats on the left could think a little bit about, Democrats in the US, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you both. It was a tough question with multiple layers to it, depending on which side of the pond you're sitting on. But look, thank you to our dear panelists, our super engaged audience. We're pretty much at time. Just a quick point, if you want to learn more, I highly encourage you to check out Cole's recent book, Paris is Not Dead, looking at hyper-gentrification, and his latest article in Time magazine on the recent elections, and Diane's piece in New Lines magazine, The French Left is United, not for the first time. So definitely check out their pieces to learn a little bit more. And let me now hand it back over to Cindy for final remarks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was super insightful. We learned so much about French politics today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And a special thank you to our speakers, Diane, Cole, and to you, Negah, for moderating this webinar so beautifully. I also want to mention Cole's book, Paris is Not Dead, and your recent publication also in Time, Macron's Disastrous Election. And Diane, you have wrote a beautiful piece, The French Left is United, not for the first time, in New Lines magazine. Please, people, check that out. It's amazing. And for those interested in further engaging with the topics discussed today and learning more about the French American Foundation, please go ahead and visit our website. And we have lots of upcoming events in our calendar. And you can find also more information on how to become a member to our Transatlantic Forum. And stay tuned for more insightful discussions. I wish you all a wonderful day, and to you both in France, a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for all your insights. It's much appreciated. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.